Language Center. I'm Associate Professor in the Department of Slavic and Near Eastern Studies. Welcome to Language Matters. This is our monthly faculty-led conversation about language teaching, methods, practices, always the best ones. So I'm so glad to have you today, and I'm so excited to introduce two not just colleagues, but two dear friends and former graduate students of mine. Before I do that, just draw your attention very quickly, please do go to our University of Texas Language Center website. I wanted to bring it to your attention in particular, this same event next month, the last one of the fall semester. We're keeping up this theme of applied literature, in, as it were, in the service of language and language in the service of literature, with a presentation by Devon Donahue Bergeler. She is going to be doing a presentation called Language Matters, Is the Drama Worth It? Monday, November 14th, same time, same place, 2 o'clock here in this very room. Please join us, tell your colleagues, tell your friends to come in. And that will be the third in this series of applied literature panels that we're doing. We'll also be doing in the spring a special one-day webinar that will be done on the weekend on a Saturday. The date, Betsy, how you remind me, is February 11th? I want to say, yes, February 11th is the date we've tentatively set. I hope we can stick with that, which is a one-day Saturday workshop, bringing in some other instructors from around the state who are also using literature and teaching their language classes. So, with no further ado, as I said, I really want to get to the topic today of looking at applied literature in the service of teaching language in general, but Russian specifically, by introducing two of our distinguished teaching faculty from the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies. Katya Kote and Marina Alexandrova both come to us first from the program in comparative literature, where they both received their PhDs in the last now 4-ish years. Both of them worked with themes that were related to Russian and other national literature, so they've been instructors in our program for these many past years, receiving distinction both in their teaching, but also in the work that they do in developing new materials. Of note, I wanted to be sure to mention an ongoing project that we hope will come to fruition in the near future, at least, of putting a number of our materials for our intensive language program online. And the two of them have been working tirelessly on developing these materials, both for online presentation and for incorporation into our live classrooms. So I know they're both working on those. So to talk to us about applied literature and the teaching of Russian and other languages as well, it's my pleasure to introduce Drs. Marina Alexandrova and Dr. Yekaterina Kote. Thank you.
Thank you. And today we have a joint presentation, so we'll be taking turns speaking, and we would welcome your questions at the end. So we'll give our presentation first, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So let me pull up our presentation, which we co-created. So yes. Well, thank you so much for coming, and it's our pleasure to talk about the intensive model of teaching Russian at UT, and specifically how we use literature in our intensive Russian course. So the need and the urgency to really negotiate the place for authentic literature, and especially creative literature, fine literature, I think it's very relevant and prominent right now, specifically because of the pressures and demands, administrative demands on teachers of languages to comply with various assessment standards and models that are being used across universities right now. And I'm speaking more specifically about SACSCOC accreditation that I was involved with, or I've been involved with for 3 years now. And SACSCOC stands for Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges. And this is an organization that demands all of the departments at UT to submit regular assessments and show the progress of their students and show the changes that are being introduced by teachers to show where the department is going in terms of assessment and making sure the students receive world-class education and they're becoming the citizens of the world. So thinking about those demands and how does authentic literature fit into those demands, or how we can make authentic literature work towards those demands, is why it is so important to talk about those issues, and that's what we're going to do today. So a couple of notes about the theory behind the incorporation of literature into a language classroom. Of course, generations of teachers have been doing it, and usually it's followed a traditional model that we'll talk about a little later. But what is different now is that we have various models that are introduced by various agencies, different nonprofit organizations that are working closely with the government and other organizations, and those models are informing the way we're teaching language right now. So for example, one of the cute pictures and diagrams, and there will be several of them, is developed by the Center for Applied Linguistics based in Washington, D.C. And it tells us what exactly our students need to be learning in terms of competence, interpretive, presentational, and interpersonal skills, and at the center of it is communication, right? And we have cultures, connections, comparison, communities, which form the 4 C's of both K-12 education right now and also college education, or teaching of languages in colleges. So this model demonstrates exactly where our literature would fit, right? So since by studying and incorporating authentic sources, we will be talking about the connections with cultures and communities and comparisons. So we're bringing all the 4 C's together in our presentation of authentic texts. Moving on, there's another pretty diagram. The Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction created a model to illustrate the relationships between state standards based on the national standards and performance assessment. So performance assessment, as I mentioned before, plays a key role now in design, the curricular design for all of our departments, so you have to be aware of that. So as in the previous model, the 3 modes of communication standard dominate the center of the model. The authors write, in a world language classroom, standards influence the curriculum, assessment, and instruction. The 3 purposes of communication, interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational, form the heart. Culture is always embedded in the instruction, connections, comparisons, and communities enrich the learning activities. The performance standards inform the assessments that show students their progress toward higher levels of proficiency in using the target language. The focus on what students can do with the language they're learning. And we've all seen the can-do statements, or a list of can-do statements that students can actually fill out themselves on ACTFL website and see where they stand in terms of language learning at specific stages of their trajectory, language learning trajectory. And the last pretty diagram that I'm going to talk about is actually by ACTFL that developed standards that we're specifically using in our instruction of Russian at UT. And our main core text, Live from Russia, actually is based on those standards. So I would like you to see where our students should be at intermediate level, which is 2nd year Russian, which is what we're focusing on today, in terms of their reading comprehension. So at the intermediate level, readers can understand information conveyed in simple, predictable, and loosely connected texts. And this is also partly goes to show that we're challenging our students beyond ACTFL standards for intermediate by letting them choose authentic texts in Russian that are not abridged, they're not prepared for non-native speakers. So, and I hope that Katya could also show how difficult the texts are and how our students are excelling in their integration of that material. They can most easily understand information if the format of the text is familiar, such as a weather report or a social announcement, which, again, our students can understand much more after the intensive instruction in the fall, and then in the spring they actually can blossom into those informed readers of the Russian language. And towards the bottom, these intermediate level readers are most accurate when getting meaning from simple, straightforward texts. They are able to understand messages found in highly familiar everyday contexts. At this level, readers may not fully understand texts that are detailed, or those texts in which knowledge of language structures is essential in order to understand sequencing, time frame, and chronology. And again, in our case, for example, that we'll show in a moment, our students will be tackling such difficult texts as Daniel Harms, for example, or Sorokin, right, or which one would you? Pushkin, right, and of course Chekhov. So I'll turn it over to you at this point. Oh yes, let me say just one more moment, yes, about the traditional or Russian approach to introducing Russian literature in the language environment or classroom environment. So usually it used to be heavily structured and controlled, so extensive scaffolding through pre- and post-reading exercises and vocabulary. Students usually used specifically designed textbooks so they could actually digest those smaller portions of text that are introduced by the introduction of new vocabulary or questions before and after. So also there was an emphasis on spiritual enrichment. So the texts were often chosen just because they belong to this dearly held canon of Russian works that every Russian person or every person who is an expert in Russian culture should know. Also usually they were assigned as домашнее чтение, reading at home, so they were not part of classroom instruction and there was not really kind of an output in terms of presentation in front of the class. And they mostly short stories by great writers and geared towards increasing lexical minimum, not so much towards solving real-life tasks. And as we're changing this model due to new expectations from our administration and also from our students, we talked about with Katya about the different demands and different ways in which we're modifying the way that literature is introduced to our students.
Absolutely.
Yes, we're going to discuss
So as we've just heard, as Marina just mentioned, at intermediate level, the expectation would be understanding simple texts. And what are we doing here then by throwing those daunting, challenging texts at our students? What are we doing? Possibly asking them to read and comprehend Chekhov or Tolstoy or Bulgakov. If we are looking at the particular teaching model that we're using, the intensive classroom, by the second semester they are already prepared for those tasks. And let's just let me just talk more about the intensive learning model that we have here. As Marina also mentioned, it's a more utilitarian approach towards solving real-life problems, and it is learning that is primarily project-based and student-led activities. So if we are looking at the flipped classroom models, it is the model that encourages students to be ready to take charge of their own education. So the contact hours that they have in class are going to be greatly supplemented by the hours that they spend on learning on their own. We are targeting in particular the digital learners, the digital natives, people who feel very comfortable functioning online, who actually feel more comfortable interacting online nowadays than interacting face-to-face, for whom it is much easier, say, to strike a conversation online with a person, like in a messenger, WhatsApp, than maybe in real life, in a real-life environment, maybe in the classroom. It has its upsides and downsides, but what we're trying to do here is we're trying to take advantage of the fact that students communicate at all, at least online. Basically, sorry, looking where I am. So the intensive model by the second semester trains students to think in a very particular way. Because essentially intensive Russian classes are 2 years squeezed into one, basically one semester for 2 semesters. By second semester, they are courageous enough to undertake the tasks that normally would prove a challenge for them. So not only are we training students in language acquisition, we're also training them to feel in charge of their own learning. So we're not just training language learners, we're just training learners, period. So by the second semester, they gain the momentum necessary to tackle the difficult task of reading literature in the target language. In the first semester, the portfolio activities that they were doing, which is a part of their grade, involve performing from simple to, I would say, like medium level online research, where, for example, they could go to a website and buy furniture, or they can pursue their own interests and maybe write a biography of their favorite football star, their favorite hockey player, or write something that maybe applies to their major. So they are used to reading independently, which we have trained them in the first semester. So when we actually tell them in the beginning of the second semester that they're going to be reading a book, they are not feeling that they are not ready for this task. So really, in addition to language acquisition, we are breaking their psychological barrier and removing the fears associated with functioning in a new language. No, I can't do that, that's a difficult text, it contains lots of difficult words, as opposed to, yes, I can do it, I've already done it, I've already read in Russian, I've already conducted basic research online, so here I am. And cultural portfolios, which basically are the assignments 15 to 17 that they have to submit at the end of the first semester, consisting of those short entries, is what essentially prepares them for this task. So, in terms of choosing a book, as Marina mentioned, it's very common to use in a language classroom a collected edition, maybe of texts that are very well a part of the classical canon. That already comes pre-selected, maybe already has vocabulary lists and tasks assigned to it. We are stepping away from that model in allowing our students to choose their own reading materials based on their own interests. So they feel really in charge. The first step would be to order a book from kniga.com. That's a New York-based bookstore where the books are fairly inexpensive. We're definitely mindful of the student's budget. And where the book would arrive very fast, maybe within a week, if not several days, as opposed to if they had to order that from a Russian bookstore, it would take forever. They of course have the option of checking out a book from the library, but that would say limit their ability to make notes, maybe marginally, and so on. And ordering a book at kniga.com also counts as a portfolio activity, so they can print out the order, cross it out, whatever identifying information they have there, and submit it as a portfolio activity, which works great. For electronic books, should they choose it, they can go to litres.com or lib.ru and choose a text from there. Litres.com is the biggest online store of electronic books, where you actually pay for a book before downloading it, even though they have some free samples. So they can download it and read it off their Kindle. But we also will talk about the whole approach to choosing a book, whether it should be paper or electronic. And at lib.ru, they can find a free text, so all classics usually are there, some of the contemporary writers, and lib.ru is a legitimate website, which is very important, considering that Russian internet is reading with piracy, and we do not want to encourage our students essentially to capitalize on the illegal practices that are definitely problematic in contemporary Russia. So either one of them would work. And if you would like to say something about paper versus electronic.
Yes, and also as Katya mentioned, that we allow students to let their interests guide them in the selection of books, and maybe it's not the books that we necessarily would have chosen. And this is also an interesting example of letting the students lead and then just dealing with the consequences, right? Because sometimes they will choose a book that would not be considered a canon book or a book that belongs to high literature. As one of my students was teaching culinary memoirs written by one author. You probably know also this student, and I will cringe several times at the choice of words of the author of the book, so I didn't really agree with that, but then it is something that my student chose, so we discussed those word choices and how to work with that. But among other interesting instances of what my students have chosen would be fighter planes, Russian fighter planes, because, for example, that's a person who's interested in military history, or Chekhov's Lady with a Dog, famously, or Seagull, which is really, easy to approach and digest, and it's a shorter format. Some of them were very ambitious and chose Amyatin's We, for example, and read first 50 pages and hoped to read more after the class is over. And one of my probably most striking examples was Sorokin's Dень Опричника, or Day of the Опричник. That is his notorious 2006 novel that proved to be a prophetic book that describes basically Russia 10 years into the future, which is what we see right now. So lots of very interesting choices, and I encourage my students to get paper editions, actually, just because it's very important to have this direct contact with an object from another culture. At least for me, I'm an old school person like that. But a lot of them read their books on electronic devices, and I don't know what Katya's take is on that, but I feel that whatever works for students is highly encouraged. The problem with electronic editions is that sometimes they don't have page numbers, so it's a little harder to navigate. But otherwise, it is not a huge difference for me or in terms of teaching.
That's also something that I've been thinking a lot about, especially because for myself I belong to the older generation of readers who are used, to flip in books and to smell in the old books, inhaling that beauty of it. So it is incredibly difficult for me to switch to the new format, to Kindle, but I have to be aware of the fact that I'm dealing with a generation of readers who are used to Kindles and for whom that proves to be the most efficient and also the most the cheapest option. And portable, you can take it anywhere. You can also make notes in Kindle. You can make notes in PDF if you're reading that as a PDF. The concern here becomes, of course, that if you have a book in electronic format, it's extremely easy to copy-paste from it and say copy-paste into Google Translate and translate that, which kind of cancels the whole learning experience, in my opinion, completely. But if that is the case, it is usually very easy to detect that, knowing the level of the student and seeing the reading journals that the student turns in. You can see that the language that the student is using to answer questions is not consistent with the student's classroom performance, with the homework that the student turns in. So you definitely can be aware of that, and I think we all tend to give the anti-Google Translate speech at the beginning of the class, anathemizing it. But it's definitely not a friend to the students. And also in terms of paper, sometimes maybe that is the ultimate paper reading experience, like reading the book on the paper that the student will get. So I definitely tend to encourage them as much as I can towards that, not to even mention the fact that you can underline words and you can make comments in the margins. It is just a very productive experience that we have. So we kind of, it's like almost like tug and pull in terms of electronic and paper.
And also we had a discussion about choosing authentic texts and the problem of allowing students to choose translated texts. So there are lots of pros and cons, and I would love to hear your opinion as language educators. Would you allow your students to read a book that's been translated or not? So in my experience, some of my students really begged me to read Harry Potter, just because they love this book in English, and they claimed that it was still an important cultural artifact because all Russians are obsessed with Harry Potter too. So there's a validity to that argument, and it's definitely more approachable than, let's say, Chekhov or Pushkin for second-year students of Russian or intensive first-year students of Russian. But it comes, of course, with problems. So do you see any problems with choosing the text?
Yeah, absolutely. So I pretty much have the same experience. I also would like to hear your take on that. Because once again, if we're trying to teach culture in addition to teaching the language, choosing Chekhov over Harry Potter would definitely be the best idea. On the other hand, if we are trying to essentially cater to the students' desire to read anything and expand their vocabulary, then Harry Potter is as good as anything, to be honest. I tend to encourage my students to, if they choose a translation, to choose a translation that has a cultural status in Russian culture. For example, Little Prince, that some of my students choose. It almost reads like a Russian book right now, and in terms of its influence on Russian culture, it's significant. Any Russian can quote it offhand. The famous phrase, "We're responsible for those whom we tame, вы ответственны за тех, кого мы приручаем," that is the quotation that any Russian would recognize immediately. And it definitely speaks to people's soul. It's definitely a book that makes you a better person, in my opinion. So if they want to have something easier and in translation, that's kind of where I'm going to push them. On the other hand, I also had a student who was very big on video games. And one of the video games is called Wiedźmak, Witcher, which is based on the fantasy novel of a contemporary Polish writer, Andrzej Sapkowski, which is incredibly popular in Russia all over. If he reads that book, I thought, he would have something, some kind of choice of topics at a cocktail party with a Russian. If he knows who are Geralt and Ciri, the characters of the book, he would have something to talk about to a contemporary Russian. So I allowed him, and he wrote fabulous journal entries. He definitely was very engaged with this book. So in that case, I don't feel particularly happy about that choice. But if that's what makes him read and explore, then sure, I will let him.
Yeah, so on that note, maybe I'll show the example of how my student worked with Sorokin's novel, and then we'll see a little bit of progress, well, a lot of progress there among several reports that they had to submit. So I think we didn't talk about the structure of the assignment yet, right? So there are three checks of their progress through the book throughout the semester, and then at the end of the semester, the whole project culminates on their presentation in front of our classmates, and I will let you talk about that. But just to show how my students tackled День опричника, the day of the опричник, so we have a shorter entry for the first submission, and unfortunately it's only in Russian. So we see here that there are many mistakes, right, as he is just beginning reading of the book, and he is talking about some new words that he saw there, and he is...
So how far in the semester would this be?
Oh, this will be first 1 month into the semester.
The spring
right.
semester.
The spring semester.
Okay.
So the spring semester, and this is after they submitted the page where they bought the book, and sometimes I ask them to write several sentences why they chose the book, how it speaks to their personal interests, and this is the first report of actually what they've read and what they think about it and what they think will be in the future. So the first one is full of mistakes and a shorter one. The second one, 2 months into the semester, so доклад по книге номер 2, it's already more varied in terms of his usage of Russian language. It's more nuanced, and the part that's about his personal impressions is already expanded, and he is talking about how the book is not realistic, and he's disagreeing where the author is going and how he is describing various atrocities committed by the
Sorry, but again, the numbers here are referring to the questions you posed
yes,
to them.
and Katya will talk about the template, so
good.
go, yeah. So jumped ahead a little bit here, but we'll explain what it means, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then towards the end, the third submission was when he was around page 50, and he is talking about the main topic of the novel overall, and he is talking about the similarities between the reality described by Sorokin in the book and what's going on in current and modern Russia. And so we're going away from the text and actually into the reality and the political reality in Russia, which is, I think, is so significant because intensive course is not only language but also culture, so and politics, and we devote a lot of time discussing the current state of events in Russia. And so this book was a real bridge from just linguistic acquisition into cultural and cultural expertise and building that cultural expertise. And this is his script for the presentation at the end, and we see now the five and a half paragraph structure here. So he is talking about the plot, the characters, everything that he found challenging or delightful about this novel, about his process of reading and working with this text. And also, again, as we talked about breaking psychological barriers, this whole project is very important because students share their failures and successes in reading and tackling those texts, because it's not always successful. Sometimes they have to actually change the book that they're chose in the beginning. It happened several times in my practice when after a month of struggling with the book, the student will be, give me something easier, this is not workable. So, and we just have to be ready for those situations and take them, kind of also teaching them life skills, right? If something is, just not, you're not there yet, you just have to take a step back. It's okay to choose something else. So I'll turn it over to you, maybe we can talk about this.
How far did he get into Xenoprichnika? How many pages?
About 100 pages. So
Seriously?
Yes,
Wow.
but he was also one of the more dedicated students
Wow, that's amazing.
who was really taken with the book and wanted to read more and learn more about it.
I also had a student who, she was reading The Scarlet Sails by Alexander Green, Ali Parusa. And not only did she finish the whole story, she wrote amazing journal entries. Her presentation was stunning. I wish I had a video of it. She also watched the movie with Anastasia Vertinskaya, and that was also part of her presentation. So it's interesting how one cultural artifact, a book, can lead you to the exploration of other cultural artifacts. In that case, movies, works influenced by the book status in contemporary culture, and so on. In terms of the book template that we've just seen in Marina's students' responses, so it is fairly basic but structured. So we have the title of the books, name of the author, summarize the text you have read since the last book report, so it's 5 to 7 sentences, what new and useful words or idioms you have found, what words keep recurring, list 5 words or idioms. And make your own sentence using one of 7 of the words you have listed above. I'm thinking now, it's kind of been my sort of plan for next semester, maybe encourage them to create vocabulary lists and share with their classmates, something that we can do on Canvas, for example, where they would kind of keep each other updated on what they're reading, or maybe encourage them to upload their reports on Canvas to the conversation section. I think that could be productive. Once again, I am not sure how realistic it is to expect that anybody would read that, or anybody would read whole of it, but I think that could be like a next step, like where I would want to take it, is to kind of encourage them to share and share the new words that they're learning and keeping each other updated even before they are presenting on their work.
Could be a wonderful part of the online